Welcome to the opening panel session of the Australian Pavilion. My name is Claire Anderson and I'm the Group Director of Sustainability Performance at Worley. And I'm very delighted to be here today. And to start, I might, whilst we're not on Australian lands, I'd still like to start with acknowledging the traditional owners of Australia and the Torres Strait Islands and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So today I'm going to sit down. Today we've got a great panel for you. In fact, there's only two panel members and myself. There's obviously been some logistical concerns just getting people in to start at this stage. But where I'd like to start is to introduce my fellow panellists, and then I will do a bit of a debrief on what we're going to talk about today. And I've got a number of different questions to ask the panellists. So I'd like to start with Jelle Nederstigt, who comes from The Hague. And Jelle is part of Worley, and he is our President of Europe and Central Asia. Jelle is an electrical engineer by background. He's been with Worley since 1997 and has had a number of different roles with Worley, including roles in Oman, in Belgium and the Netherlands, as well as a past president of Europe, the Middle East and Africa. And as I found out this morning in chatting to Jelle, Jelle has, in terms of his academic background, he is a graduate from the Eindhoven University of Technology and also the University of Florida, where he did his work in actually automation of anaesthetics over 3 or 4 decades ago. So early AI there. Thanks, Jelle. Jelle is also Worley's Commissioner of the Energy Transition Commission, and he is the proud father of 3 children and most recently a grandfather of one young grandson. So welcome, Jelle. Thank you for joining us today. And on my right, I have Christian Déséglise, who is the Group Head of Sustainable Infrastructure and Innovation at HSBC. Christian has many academic achievements, including a master's degree from La Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris and a Master's of International Affairs from Columbia University in New York. Christian has held various positions with HSBC, including Head of Sustainable Finance and Investments, the Global Head of several central banks and sovereign wealth funds at HSBC, and the Global Head of Emerging Markets at HSBC. Christian also leads the Fast Infra initiative, aiming to mobilise private investment to finance sustainable infrastructure. So, a fantastic panellist to have with us. Other credentials include co-chair of the WEF Global Future Council on SDG investments, co-chair of the Sustainable Infrastructure Working Group of the Prince of Wales Sustainable Market Initiative, co-chair of working groups of Glasgow Final and Alliance for Net Zero, and the list goes on. And I will end with saying that most proudly Christian and his wife have established a foundation, Caring for Colombia, which is a not-for-profit organisation that provides assistance to the underprivileged in Colombia. Great. All right. So thank you to my 2 panellists for coming today. So the title of the session here is around hydrogen and CCS, but we're going to broaden it out a bit more and talk about financial investment as well and how to make it happen. We know that decarbonisation will be really, really difficult, and we know that it's arguably the biggest challenge that we've got on our agenda at the moment. We also know that we need a broad suite of solutions. There will be no silver bullet. So we need to have everything on the table to solve what is a complex technical, social and financial challenge. So with that, I will start with my first question to Jelle. In your role as President of Europe and Central Asia of Worley, can you tell us about some of the hydrogen projects that are currently underway in Europe and the role Worley has on these projects. Thanks, Jelle.
Sure. Yep, it's audible. Okay, thanks, Claire, and good to be here at the opening session of the Australia Pavilion. Thanks for hosting us. Yeah, projects in the hydrogen space and in the CCUS space. In the past few years, I can say we had an avalanche of projects in that space, but mostly study work. So we will talk about that a little bit later. It's not so easy to get them over the line financially to be investable. Currently, we are working in Europe for Shell, that's open information, on the largest green hydrogen plant in construction in Europe. That's 200 megawatts. And we are doing what we call EP, which means engineering and procurement. And currently the construction is around 70% progress. So that is really something tangible in construction. A lot of other projects are very close to FID, financial investment decision. But as I said before, that is difficult, and it requires a few hurdles to overcome. This is about green hydrogen. On blue hydrogen, for those of you who don't really know that, that is hydrogen produced the traditional method, but then combined with carbon capture and storage or utilization. Mainly in the US, we are doing work. So we are doing around 40 projects at the moment, of which only 4 are past FID. So that's a small percentage. Again, a lot of study work. Those 40 projects represent a carbon storage capacity of around 90 megaton per annum. And if you imagine that the current available storage capacity is 50, you can imagine that globally that is already a big deal. So you see that it's increasing. What we are also doing is what's called DAC, direct air capture. That is basically capturing CO2 directly from the air. That's a project called Stratos in the US, which is currently being built as well. So there is various technologies, but the industry as a whole is still in its relative infancy, I would say.
Thanks, Jelle. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, actually, that Worley, who myself and Jelle both represent, is a large global engineering and construction company. We are Australian listed, but we're very much at the forefront of building some of these emerging technologies like green hydrogen, like blue hydrogen, and certainly very heavily involved in direct air capture. So with that, I would like to now turn to Christian and ask you around the financial side of things, and how does HSBC support the development of decarbonisation technologies in general, and particularly where it's newly forming industries?
Okay, thank you very much, Claire, and thanks a lot for the invitation and the partnership with Worley over the years. Pleasure to be with you. I think you kind of like set the scene in your introductory remarks when you said decarbonization is not going to be easy and there is no magic wand. There is, I think, often a perception that finance can be the magic wand, and we've been trying to push back a little bit on that, saying that finance doesn't really happen in a vacuum. We've made some ambitious goals in terms of financing the transition. We said 3-4 years ago now that we would be providing between $750 billion and $1 trillion of sustainable finance and investment by 2030, and we are well ahead of that plan. We've, as of now, provided approximately $334 billion to advance and progress the transition to net zero. But the role of a bank is really to accompany the clients. Finance doesn't really happen in a vacuum. The transition on the ground is being made and done by policies, policymakers, and businesses that are actually driving the transition in the real economy. But banks have, I think, a very important role to play. Finance is a lever that will make this decarbonization possible. And I think we've got several roles to play. So one is around financing mature technologies. And doing more in terms of financing of deployment at scale of mature technologies. And we're doing more of that. So we set up what we call a net zero investment framework, which is allowing us to guide our capital for mature technologies and deployment of mature technologies, especially in the geographies where HSBC is present. So it has a lot to do with Asia, Middle East, Europe, and the US, of course, but there is a specific role in terms of pushing the transition in emerging and developing countries. The second area is around nascent technologies. And our net zero investment frameworks also identifies a series of technologies that we need for deep decarbonization. And I think we all know the statistics, but when it comes to technologies that are needed for decarbonization by 2050, approximately 35% of them don't exist today or don't exist at scale. So whether we're talking about SAF, whether we're talking about hydrogen, clean hydrogen, whether we're talking about carbon capture and long duration storage and so on and so forth. So we have a role also to play there. And play, I would say, a catalytic role. So how do we do that? We do that by partnering very often. So we are an anchor investor in the Breakthrough Energy Catalyst Fund, which is precisely looking at scale up of clean hydrogen, of carbon capture, and so on and so forth, and providing demand signals that will help projects, that will help scale projects. So that's an important part. We're also partnering, I will say, at the ecosystem level. So engaging with governments, engaging with policymakers, doing research, not only for clean hydrogen, but also for things like natural capital, nature-based solutions. So we teamed up with WWF, for instance. We created with Pollination the first funds to invest in natural capital and scale natural capital. So I think we've got a role to play there in helping scale those technologies that are difficult to scale today. And then there is something around, and I kind of touched on it earlier, how do we make sure that those technologies are not only deployed in the developed world, but also go to the emerging markets. And I know that's something which is dear to your heart, but about 70% of emissions today are coming from emerging markets. So what role can a bank and the ecosystem play to accelerate and scale up the development of those technologies, both mature and nascent in the global south, is something which is very important.
Thanks, Christian. Fantastic set of ideas there, and some of the work that we've been doing at Worley is around looking at how we think about the energy transition differently. We've got a set of series of thought leadership pieces that we've done with Princeton, on which we call From Ambition to Reality, and it looks at this paradigm shift of how we get to net zero in a very different way, because we look at it from the perspective, if we did things the way we always do, we currently do, we just won't get there. And part of that touches on what you were saying, I think, Christian, around technology and developing technology, but also working together in different and new ways, and certainly that theme around developing economies and how to bring developing economies in.
And Claire, I would encourage people to look at this report, because this report is amazing. It's one of the foundational reports, I think, to look at the transition in the US. But yes. I think the focus has been mostly on the US, but looking at the nitty-gritty and how difficult from an engineering point of view as well as finance point of view it's going to be. I think it's a phenomenal report.
Oh, thank you, Christian. So with that, I will move on to my next question for Jelle. And based on experiences so far, what do you think are some of the key learnings from the infrastructure perspective as a company that engineers and constructs projects in continuing to move these industries forward? Thanks, Jelle.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. What we see today is the projects that go forward mostly have an off-taker which is the same company as the company developing the project. So if you look at the business case, I talked about it before, it becomes very, very marginal. In the 30 years of my career, there is not one year where I've heard the two words marginally investable more. And this is in every project in the energy transition space, unfortunately. So one of the learnings is that we need really credible and reliable subsidy schemes. I mean, typically our customers, because what we have seen so far, for example, we had an avalanche of study work focused on Europe, for example, because customers thought, okay, this is interesting. There's the European Green Deal, there's a lot of subsidy available. Suddenly it went a little bit slower, and then the Inflation Reduction Act came, so all these customers from one day to the other, they jumped over to the US, until they found out just before Christmas that there were a few small letter items connected to the Inflation Reduction Act. The investment, there were a few extra rules to get the subsidy, and you see some of them moving back to Europe. So this made the whole ecosystem very fragile, and it really is very unpredictable, difficult to manage. So clarity and stability of the subsidy schemes, that is a big learning that is not there at the moment, and that has to change if these projects have to go forward, which they have to. So I would also say grid development, especially if you look at the green side, it's very depending on availability of electricity, availability of land, and that is very difficult nowadays still. So also there's a lot of plans, super ambitious, global development, global thinking, very large ones, but they are then stopped because of inability of the electrical grid to keep track of this. So that is a big learning that we got. And then a third thing is many of the customers are also active in the more traditional space. I already mentioned Shell. Companies, the big oil companies, they are also investing in green energy at the moment. But those projects are set up kind of the traditional way, and that makes them more expensive. If you build a green hydrogen plant with the specifications of a refinery, well, you can imagine what happens. It becomes too expensive, and it becomes bespoke rather than standardized. So these type of discussions we are currently having with our customers, how to standardize, how to productize this type of developments. And that is very, very different from projects that we did in the past. Does that help?
Yes, that helps a lot. Thanks, Jelle. Yes, we're hearing a lot about some of the challenges that come with the transition. And so my next question, Christian, is around, from your perspective, from a HSBC perspective, but also from your perspective in the various roles that you play in the transition. What do you see as some of the greatest risks in low carbon industry investment, and what can be done about these risks?
So where do we start? Well, I think there is an overlap with what was just said. I think permitting is certainly a big issue. And it's not, we were talking about the difference or different types of challenges in emerging and developing countries. I think permitting is an issue everywhere, in the US as well as in Indonesia. And I think it's one of the serious bottlenecks. for development of low carbon solutions. So not only for the production of clean electricity, thinking solar and wind, for instance, but also distribution and grid. There is a stark need for more distribution and grid capacity. And without proper permitting rules and fast permitting rules, it's just not happening. Connection to the grid and so on and so forth. So we see that as a bottleneck pretty much everywhere. You mentioned off-take risk, obviously something which is extremely serious, extremely important. Here I would say there is maybe more of an emerging market dimension to it, because the quality of the off-taker in emerging markets, especially when, it could be the government, could be some SOE, state-owned enterprise, but could also be some private companies. So there is a wide variety of credit worthiness, or a wide array of credit worthiness in terms of off-taker risk. So that's definitely an issue, not only for hydrogen, but also for clean electrons. It's exactly the same thing. Something around, which leads me to something around cost of capital, which is a very significant issue, especially when it comes to development, deployment of clean technologies in emerging and developing countries, where the rating of the country, the credit risk, the FX issues are really a very significant hindrance in terms of mobilization of finance, because it's difficult. I mean, it's pretty much impossible to finance a project which will have a cost of capital of 15%. There are very few. So without blended finance, without some solutions that will provide some risk enhancement or de-risking structure, it's challenging. So, I mean, I would say these are some of the risks that we're seeing. In terms of solutions, so I think blended finance is one of them. So working with philanthropy, working with multilateral development banks, working with the private sector, with various types of investors to identify the risks in a project and see how we can best share it, depending on the risk return profile of each of the participants. So, you mentioned just now bankability. We set up, together with Temasek, HSBC, and Temasek set up a joint venture in Singapore that is dedicated to providing finance for marginally bankable projects in Southeast Asia. So they will be sustainable infrastructure projects mostly, wind, solar, distribution, and so on and so forth. We're not necessarily taking a technology risk, so high level of technology readiness, but we are trying to provide a solution to the issue of marginal bankability of projects by teaming up with Temasek, by teaming up with development finance institutions, and we're now actually scaling the vehicle so we can provide more financing to solve some of those risks and some of those issues that are hindering the flow of private finance. So I think there is a series of risks. I think it's important to identify each of them and look for scalable solutions that will allow us to overcome them.
Thanks, Christian. Some really good insights there, and I think it's getting the technologies that are already at those high levels of TRL across the line and financed. And then you mentioned earlier around 35% of technologies that we actually need to get to net zero aren't at that high TRL level yet either. So there's a lot of work to do. But I think you're right around identifying the risks and then having a plan around each of them and bringing that ecosystem together that you mentioned earlier as well.
Keep on talking, but
no, it's good.
it's also important to identify scalable solutions, because very often innovation has been, there is a lot of innovation, but innovation for the sake of innovation, it takes a long time and it's not necessarily what we need. I think it's extremely important to focus on solutions that can be scaled, that can be replicated, because we don't have much time.
Yes.
So if something works in a geography, whether it's off-taker risk guarantee, for instance, or whether it's a mechanism that works in terms of, bringing marginally bankable projects to bankability, issues related to project development, project prep, for instance. In emerging markets, project preparation typically takes twice as long as in the developed markets. So if we can find solutions that can be scaled quickly, let's just use them instead of innovating just for the sake of it.
Agree completely, and that's exactly where Worley is focused, on those pragmatic solutions to bringing technologies to market and scaling as quickly as possible. And Jelle, you talked about standardisation as a way to de-risk and to scale. So my next question, Jelle, for you is around where do you think we need to concentrate then in the short and medium term, thinking about hydrogen and CCS technologies specifically?
Well, the word partnership has been used a few times here. And that is not only traditional partnerships in terms of joint venture. We often team up with our customers. But what you see now, and what I strongly believe is needed, is a partnership much deeper in the supply chain. Because traditionally you have a lot of customers who want see competitiveness play out, which takes, first of all, a lot of time. Secondly, a lot of human effort. It becomes very transactional, and if you look at the vast magnitude of the effort that is needed to build the energy transition globally, no company can do that alone. And that is something that we see recently, more and more, but still not enough, is working together. Simply open up, bring knowledge, make knowledge available to even competition and to the entire supply chain. As an example, and I know we are not the only company doing that, but we are working with what we call co-creation partners to build a modularized, kind of call it a Lego, green hydrogen manufacturing plant of 200 megawatt and up. So that is something that is hopefully part of the solution, because otherwise you will never get there. If you look at the numbers that are required, it's hundreds and hundreds of green hydrogen development to become anywhere close to what the world needs. And of course, electricity is probably the first solution if it's viable, but there is a lot of issues which cannot be resolved by electrons only. You need molecules, and that will be part of the solution, but it's so enormous. I don't think many people realize how big that task is. And that's the reason that you see more and more industries coming together. And you mentioned, Christian, also the financing institutions are becoming part of that deal, because part of the discussion is who takes which risk. Because we are talking about technologies which are still in their relative infancy. So that means we don't really have a good view on the risks. All these hydrogen CCUS installations, they are being started up now at best, and we have to learn on the run. So we will see what the risks are, what works, what doesn't work, and it has to be spread in a fair way between all companies in the ecosystem, and this is very early days. This is called the finance COP. That is for a reason, because the technology, the technical stuff, we know how we can do it technically, but not yet completely financially. So a little bit of context there.
No, thank you, Jelle. That's great, and I would add to the complexity. The technical is probably the easiest part of it. It's the bringing.
I think so.
Yeah, it's the bringing together. It's the finance. It's the ecosystem. It's the working together. It's the social. This is just an incredible challenge.
If I may, Claire, social
sure.
license. That's also a big problem, a big showstopper. I mean, everybody is always enthusiastic about, oh yes, green hydrogen. Great, brilliant, until it's in your backyard and it costs a lot of land, or you have to break open all the land to build the grid. Suddenly it's, oh yeah, it's great, but please somewhere else. The famous NIMBY, it's also valid here. So what you see, I mean, Europe, I think, was a front runner, but it's definitely losing that position. Countries in the Middle East where everybody feels like, all petro states, but there's a lot of cash there, and they are investing big scale. I mentioned 200 megawatts, which is the biggest green hydrogen facility in Europe being built in construction. In various countries in the Middle East and North Africa, we are talking about 20 gigawatts. That's 100 times as big, because they have the land mass, they have the cash, and they are just going so fast. And in Europe, that's simply impossible. US is probably somewhere in between. We have to wait what election results mean. That is very early days. I mean, I know that many people are not really sure. We are also watching the situation closely. We will see. The Inflation Reduction Act you cannot simply dismantle, I think. But you see that various parties in the ecosystem hold their horses for a little while, which is a delay in itself again. So.
Yeah, thanks, Jelle. And just on the scale, I'd add that the work that was done by Net Zero America and Net Zero Australia, if you've seen that work that was done through Princeton, really drives home the scale of what it means to get to net zero. In the case of Australia, given we're at the Australian Pavilion, the Net Zero Australia work showed that to decarbonise Australia's economy, you need to actually install solar PV arrays that are 5 times the size of Tasmania, which is a state at the bottom of Australia. It's an enormous landscape impact. So again, that's why we need the diversity of technology solutions. We can't rely on just one solution. So what I might do now, Christian, is ask you to talk a little bit about the Fast Infra label, which I know you've been leading at HSBC for a number of years now, and it's a fantastic initiative around de-risking investment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claire, and thanks a lot for your support on the Fast Infra initiative. So we were just talking about partnership and ecosystem and bringing people together. We talked about finance, we talked about the just and social element to it. We didn't talk about insurance, but I know insurance is one, and I believe there was an insurer that was supposed to be on that panel. But insurance, I think, is also part of the solution. So just a few words on the Fast Infra label, which is an initiative that indeed we've been co-leading for a few years now. So the exam question was, how do we create, how do we transform sustainable infrastructure into a deep and liquid asset class? So you mentioned the magnitude of the challenge from a physical point of view, but it's also from a finance point of view, because we have to mobilize trillions pretty quickly. And so we put together, it was originally at the initiative of the One Planet Summit, which was a French President Macron summit. And we put together a group of stakeholders to think about what sustainable infrastructure was and what practical solutions we could bring to help create an asset class out of sustainable infrastructure. So we had representatives from government, multilateral development banks, private sector, insurance companies, developers, sponsors, financiers like HSBC, a lot of not-for-profits also to think about the social element. And we started on a task to try and define what sustainable infrastructure is. Because you've got, I think at the time when we started, there were like 40 different frameworks and 40 different definitions of sustainable infrastructure, but there was no label, like you have a green bond label, like you have a green building label, you know, with certification by LEED or certification by BREEAM. So we said, well, maybe the first thing we should be doing is define what sustainable infrastructure is, and that will help, that will be one of the building blocks for creating an asset class. Because if we know what we're talking about, then we can start, you know, changing the way projects are developed according to certain norms. We can embed higher sustainability criteria into the development of infrastructure projects. We can agree on what a due diligence for environment and social and climate risks would be. So it will be one of the, it's not a magic one, but it will be one of the elements that will contribute to the making of an asset class. And so that's what we did for a couple of years, and we launched at Glasgow, actually, at COP26, the Sustainable Infrastructure Label, which was endorsed by pretty much all the big investors in the world, the G-Funds, the Sustainable Markets Initiative, all the coalitions of institutional investors. And it's an interesting label because it's not only about ESG, about the environmental side and the social and governance side of infrastructure assets, but also about climate resiliency. What does make an infrastructure project resilient to climate change and to climate risk? And I think that element is becoming increasingly important today, and can allow us to develop and build infrastructure assets with a higher level of creditworthiness, basically, because it will be more resilient, more resistant to climate change. So the label was launched. We asked Global Infrastructure Basel to act as secretariat for the label. It's a specialist foundation in Switzerland with a lot of experience in creation of these types of labels, and Bloomberg is doing the data repository for all the data pertaining to labeled assets. And I'm glad to report that we are now, I think we've got $7 billion of assets that have been labeled. We've got about 25 projects which are either labeled or in the process of being labeled. And we're really looking now at what we can do to increase the uptake by the industry and make it something which will really allow to, at the end of the day, embed higher sustainability criteria in infrastructure assets. It's important because infrastructure assets represent approximately 75% of CO2 emissions globally. So think about power, think about transport, building, built environment, and so on and so forth. We're talking about 75% of global emissions. And retrofitting and developing new infra assets with sustainability in mind is critical if we want to meet the Paris Agreement targets, especially in emerging markets where we estimate that in the next 30 years, emerging markets will pretty much have to double their stock of infrastructure assets. Yeah, urbanization, economic development, and so on and so forth. We're talking about a doubling of infra assets.
Thanks, Christian, and congratulations on Fast Infra. I think it's a fabulous initiative around creating trust, which is a good segue into the next topic I'd like to touch on. And we've talked about creating these ecosystems across supply chains, across project developers, across financiers, so that we can accelerate the getting this infrastructure in the ground, and what you've just talked about, Christian, around what needs to actually happen, particularly in the developing world. This has all got to happen quickly, it's got to happen at scale. So trust between partners, between the ecosystems, is really important. And one of the things that Worley and Princeton have just done in our latest From Ambition to Reality paper, which is number 4, is we've looked at the theme of trust. So my question to Jelle actually is around what is your view on the role of trust in infrastructure development?
My view is very simple. That's critical. I mentioned it already. My view is also that we are nowhere at the moment, because I still believe that everybody is competing, and that will not bring us over the finish line in the task that we have at hand. So this research with Princeton pointed out a topic, pointed out that everybody agreed with it, and also pointed out that everybody agreed that there is a long road ahead of us, because this means that, and that's valid for our company, but also for other players in the ecosystem, that we have to share information, for example. And that means people will quickly think, hey, this goes at the cost of our own profitability, our own business case as a company, as a customer, maybe as a finance institution, Christian, as well. So it ties in with what I mentioned before. Who takes which part of the risk? And trust means that you also are open about this risk, what it does to your own company or your own institution in the ecosystem. Yeah, Claire, I think there is really a long way to go. So the study was very good. It pointed out what we need to do, yes, but it also pointed out that we are only at the very beginning. I think the whole way of doing projects has to change fundamentally.
Yes, and I think the current geopolitical situations are certainly creating some headwinds in this theme of trust.
Yeah, that is true, because trust cross-border is one thing, but trust globally, that is really, we see over the past few years, has become a little bit more difficult. And I hope we can reverse that trend, because this is about the planet, and this is not like, oh, if Europe is fine, the rest is fine, or if the US is fine, the rest is fine. We have to do this together at the end of the day, you know. We only have one planet. I'm stating the obvious here. But yeah, that's not where we are at the moment.
Thanks,
unfortunately.
Jelle. No, yes, unfortunately. And Christian, you've mentioned some of the other complexities of the issues as well around adaptation. And, you know, obviously we're now at 1.2 degrees of warming. If we keep going the way we are on track at the moment, we'll hit 1.5 in the next 2 decades. Adaptation will become significantly more important. There's the issues around nature and how do we protect ecosystems, like environmental ecosystems. Yeah, there's a lot of headwinds and a lot we've got to work out. What I might do, Christian, is just turning back to that theme of trust and how do you think the finance industry can work with project developers to move projects through financial investment decision? And given your background too in supporting developing nations, can you talk to the opportunities for investment in these nations as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the opportunities are quite significant. We actually scoped it at HSBC when we put together this net zero investment framework, you know, try to identify in which sector we should be financing in priority that have a climate impact and some, you know, business rationale for us. And it's close to $40 trillion of financing opportunities from now until 2030. So we're talking about really significant amount of money that has to be mobilized. So to do that, you will need trust at various levels, I would say. And I think it starts, as Jelle was saying, I think it starts at the policy level. So, I mean, it's an important COP, finance, obviously, but also updating NDCs. And I think it kind of starts with NDCs, but NDCs is one thing, but you have to somehow translate those NDCs into investment roadmaps. Investment roadmaps that can be understood by industries, by businesses, by finance, so they can organize themselves to, you know, to actually drive the transition on the ground in the real economy. And this is missing in many countries. So I think you need clearer policy signals, you need clearer regulations. We talked earlier about permitting of taker risk and so on and so forth. These are all very, very significant issues which are hindering the transition that needs to take place. So I think it starts with businesses. You mentioned IRA and some of the I think subsidies are quite important, especially in nascent technologies. But you need stability, you need certainty, you need visibility. If you've got something which is going to work for a couple of days, when we're talking about long investment cycle, that's not going to work, or even a couple of years. You need stability, certainty, and visibility over the long term. So I think this issue of trust is absolutely critical. And then when it goes into emerging markets and developing countries, it's not only about the policy environment, but also the various stakeholders that are going to be participating in blended finance, for instance, or the development of local ecosystems. And so you need trust with policymakers, with multilateral development banks, with institutional investors, sponsors, developers, and so on and so forth. So Fast Infra is one example where you can build trust around one label, one specific thing, but it's just one building block. You need to do that. You need to do that across the board. So quite challenging, but needed at the same time.
Thanks, Christian. We're getting close to the end of the session now, so I would like to just take a pause and see if there's any questions from the audience. Yes, we have one, and there should be a mic coming.
Who's got the question?
Thanks so much for the interesting panel. I have two questions for you. The one question is about adiabatic compressed air energy storages. The companies Core Energy, Energy Dome from Italy, and Hydrostore from Canada do it right now, and China has got 300 megawatts of spheres on the surface, and they can store 4,700 cubic meters in the spheres. And I don't know if you know the technology. I guess yes, but I would like to ask you what do you think about it? Is it for you an investment case, business case to invest in it because we need this long-term energy storages? And do you see a competition between re-electrifying hydrogen with fuel cell technology back again into electricity? Does it compete with adiabatic compressed air energy storages? And the second question for you is how does the landscape has to change? You mentioned that the project development companies and the whole process has to change, that there should be more cooperation and so on. Maybe you can name some exact points, what has to change exactly. Thank you.
Okay. Well, it's partly for you, Christian, partly for me. This was about financing of new technologies. You mentioned one technology. I think there's actually hundreds of technologies which take a part in the whole energy transition. This is one. What we have learned so far is that, it looks like there will not be one winner. We need everything, and there is a lot of new technologies emerging. People are trying out things. There's not so much at scale at the moment. I mean, compressed air, it's one. You have also, for example, heating up sand to store heat. There's a lot of this type of stuff. There's a lot of developments in the battery material space. Not only positive, also negative. Companies going bankrupt. Often these new companies in the energy transition space, they start up like kind of one-trick ponies, and if there then is something wrong in that specific sector, they immediately fall over again. So, what will be the winning technology? I don't know, but what you currently see in the market is that that basically all bets are open. It's not like it will be that and not that. Whether it's financeable, I have to look at Christian to talk about that. All these new technologies, I think you do a lot. It's high risk, I think, because some of them are in their infancy, but maybe you can give some context there.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll give a little bit of context, not on the particular technology, but on our approach to financing nascent technology. So, typically banks finance cash flows, and you need certainty, visibility on the cash flows. So when it comes to financing nascent technologies where cash flows are uncertain or at an early stage of development, it's more difficult. So what we are doing is a couple of things. First, we've been allocating a certain amount of money to invest in equity, third-party, so funds managed by third parties that are looking at nascent technologies, and long-duration storage is one of the nascent technologies that we have identified as necessary in the context of the transition. So typically, we would be investing with a specialist asset manager that has a long experience in identifying and investing in interesting technologies in the energy space, in the energy transition space. Luckily, there are many of those companies at various levels. You know, whether it's VC, whether it's Series A, B, C, whether it's growth equity. So it's interesting for us because it gives us a window into who are the winners, what are the technologies that are making it, what type of solutions we can also bring to our clients that are looking for this type of technologies. The other thing we've been doing is invest in breakthrough energy catalyst, and that's breakthrough has several pillars. One of them is long duration storage. So same thing with breakthrough. We've been partnering with breakthrough, and they're helping identify interesting companies that we can support and provide some catalytic capital, which will allow for a faster scale up. The other thing we've been doing is provide venture debt, so VC debt, for transition technologies. So typically we would provide some non-dilutive capital to early stage companies that have some cash flows. They don't need to be profitable, but we need to have some type of visibility on their future growth. And we provide some interesting VC debt building. We bought Silicon Valley Bank, SVB, I'm sorry, the UK arm of Silicon Valley Bank a couple of years ago, and we're building the innovation banking. So that's part of this effort to identify the pioneers and the companies of tomorrow and providing some new non-dilutive capital. So these are some of the things we're doing. Plus, we've been investing heavily also in experts, so technology experts that are part of the group that are providing support to the bankers, and that are experts in clean hydrogen, in carbon capture, in power systems, and so on and so forth. So I would say it's a twofold effort. One, bringing in expertise and capabilities, and two, providing some support through equity or through VC debt at an early stage.
Yeah, your second question, if I remember correctly, because it was a little bit of a long set of questions. It was not one question. Was about the change in how to execute projects. Is that correct?
Yeah, the project development ecosystem. So
yeah,
maybe the companies have to be less competitive and join more together.
Yeah, yeah. So I mentioned already a little bit on what we are experimenting with. This is then specifically a green hydrogen example, where we are trying to develop it more as a product rather than as a project. So imagine a car. Car manufacturers typically work very closely together with their suppliers of the engine and of all the many other parts. This is also happening as we speak. Before we have a concrete project, we work together with, you need compressors, you need pumps, you need an automation system. So all these outside, well, call it OEM, outside equipment manufacturers, or co-creation partners, as we now call them, they are in the tent when we don't have a project yet. And this will become like a Lego box. So you basically should imagine kind of a catalog. Okay, I want a green hydrogen plant, this and there and there, we have so much land. This is the electricity price, because don't forget, by the way, 70% of the cost of a green hydrogen is electricity. And 15% is the electrolyzers, and 15% is balance of plant. All the rest, let's say. So those equipment manufacturers are in the tent, because the cheapest way of doing this is having all the detailed information available and develop the complete integrated project together, or product together. So that's a change in mindset. We are historically a project delivery organization. It becomes more a productized organization. That is a big, big change for our customers, also for ourselves.
Thanks, Jelle.
Does that work?
Yep. We've run out of time, unfortunately. We've just got a couple of minutes left, but I really hope you've enjoyed today's panel session. I think we've heard a lot from Jelle on the project delivery side and how we make these projects happen, and then from Christian on the financing side. We know this is complex. We know we're going to have to work together. We know that, you know, we're going to have to build trust and work differently. I would like to close by asking Jelle and Christian each how they're feeling around the start of this COP, if you're feeling optimistic. And then secondly, you know, what would be your main ask in making progress towards a low carbon future? So Christian, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Thank you, Claire. Of course I'm optimistic. We need to be optimistic. Look, I think on the one side we see an enormous amount of investment in renewables. So I think this year we're going to hit $2 trillion in renewable investment, still $1 trillion in fossil fuels, but you know, the landscape has really changed very rapidly over the last few years. There is much more to be done, and I think, you know, from ambition to reality actually highlights a lot of the issues that we are going to be facing. So I think we are going in the right direction. We're seeing a lot of innovation also on the nascent technology and those spaces, but it's going to take time. And you know, we are bordering really on, we're at the limit of warming from a Paris Agreement goal point of view, and it's likely that, you know, it's going to be, we won't be able to get the decrease in emission. It's going to be very difficult to stay within, you know, well below 1.5. So I think it's important also, as we think about accelerating the technologies we need for mitigation, to think about resiliency and adaptation. I'm not saying we should favor one against the other. I think we should do both. We should be doing both, but we should really develop those infrastructure and embed the transition, but also make sure that our societies and economies are, I wouldn't say future-proof, but at least more resilient to climate change and more adapted to climate change.
Thanks, Christian. Jelle, closing remarks.
I would say I'm optimistic, but if everybody goes back in their geopolitical silos, I'm less optimistic. This is something we only can resolve as a planet together, and it goes against the developments that we now see recently, unfortunately. On the other hand, there is a few data points which still keep me optimistic. You mentioned, Christian, if you see the level of investment, if you see how fast the adaptation, especially in offshore wind and in solar PV, has gone. Nobody would have expected that. In some countries, we have now overcapacity of solar PV, believe it or not. So they don't know what to do with the electricity. So you have to switch off the solar PVs. That is where we also are. So that is a reason to be optimistic. But there is a lot of buts. So yeah, that is maybe not what you want to hear, but no, there is a lot of work to do for all of us.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to end with a round of applause for Christian and Jelle. Thank you.